This is the second of a two-part interview I did with Stan Rowe. And this is really the story of how he started a company mid-career to develop and launch an impossible product. Use a catheter to implant a heart valve for critically ill patients. And now it's the foundation of a $12 billion space within the medtech industry that's really he's the father of. At some point, you take this wonderful, big responsibility, big corporate dollars, and you jump over to the land of entrepreneurship. This is fascinating because you hadn't really done that before, I don't think. And so how did that go and what happened next?
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like that entrepreneurial experience at J&J was very helpful. And I certainly had seen a lot of entrepreneurial enterprises get started. So I was quite interested in that. But, you know, having worked on the first coronary stent, you know, we had the most successful launch of a med device in history when we launched in, I think, 1996, if I remember correctly. We sold $650 million in our first year of sales.
That's outrageous.
We drove J&J earnings.
Right.
Okay? And we would have done a lot better. I actually turned in a forecast for the product that they didn't believe.
Right.
They brought in McKinsey to look at my forecast and said, no, that'll never work. We'll build some extra inventory. We were in back order for a year. Okay.
So the market was just ready for that product somehow. Because
and we part of the problem was we made a lot of people angry by not having available inventory to meet the needs. And you know, again, J&J management didn't always support what was the best course because people were making decisions that were too far removed from the market. I think that's always the challenge in big corporate is, do you know, if you let people who are close to the market make those decisions and trust their judgment, you'll probably do better. Right. But we got overruled several times by J&J corporate management that were way too far removed to make those decisions.
I think I'm starting to see the roots of the entrepreneurial thing here.
Right.
This is the frustrated product manager who makes a wonderful entrepreneur.
So I got introduced to Alain Cribier. I'd actually attended a course where I met him years ago in valvuloplasty. He was the pioneer of balloon valvuloplasty. I met him, actually the course I went to was in Boston. And so I was kind of familiar with that. But then Stan Rabinovich, who worked with me at J&J, he was doing business development in Europe and met Cribier, who had this crazy idea of making stents basically into valves to treat aortic valve disease. So Marv Woodall, the president, and I, we met with him at one of the medical meetings, and he went over his idea, and we were pretty intrigued. So actually at J&J, I came to an agreement with Cribier to do some early work. But I left soon after to go to Datascope for a few years, where I ran business development. And that was kind of a frustrating experience because the guy who had founded Datascope wanted to grow the business and take no risk.
Right.
Right.
There you go.
And those two things don't really go together very well. And so over time I got pretty frustrated with that. J&J bought Cordis just as I was leaving, and the integration, I mean, that was actually caused me to leave. The integration of J&J and Cordis was horrific. Yes. Again, sorry, managed by McKinsey, but terrible integration. They ended up losing over time both the key J&J management and the key Cordis management. That doomed the business over time. So I left. They never did what they were supposed to do in the early development of that product for Cribier. So Cribier called me when I was at Datascope and said, "You always believed in this idea. What should we do?" And I said, "Well, the first thing we should do is get the rights back from J&J. Yeah. So I said, "You need to call this guy and tell him, hey, look, you guys haven't done anything. Give me the rights back." Yeah. They did. So with that in hand, Cribier said, okay, well, let's do something with this. And so over time, we, brought in Marty Leon, who's a prominent cardiologist that many, many people know at Columbia, and Stan Rabinovich, Marty Leon, Alain Cribier, and myself founded PVT in 1999
Right.
with the idea of making this first transcatheter valve. And of course, nobody had done anything like this, and if you talk to any valve expert, they will tell you it's a stupid idea and it'll never work.
I think
Okay?
this is another fascinating example where somehow you're contrarian enough to believe you know better, by touching the market more precisely, you can actually figure out that they're not actually generally correct, they're more specifically correct.
Yeah, I don't know if it takes, contrarian is a way to say it. I frame it differently. I just say I think good innovators are nihilists.
Nihilists.
Right?
Yes.
They look at medicine and say, really? We can't do better than that?
Right.
And I do find myself doing that. I look at certain outcomes and I go, really? Really, that's the best we can do? My favorite example of that is actually, I've never had a good solution to it, but in electrophysiology, you ever seen an electrophysiology case, Scott?
I've never watched one, but I've watched them on video. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, on video you see them. They look amazingly technical, right? I can do a 3D mapping of the atrial wall and look at reentrant pathways, and it looks really high tech.
Yeah.
But you ask yourself, what are you doing?
Right.
You're frying
Yes.
to treat AFib
Right.
with RF or cryo or PFA. I don't care. You're killing it off.
Yeah.
That's your best answer.
Right. That can't be right.
It can't. So I always say, 30 years from now, we're going to look at that and say, do you know how we used to treat AFib?
Right.
Right? Because it's a really bad answer, right? It's a really,
Yes, you're right.
not an elegant
Cox-Maze,
solution.
Cox-Maze procedure, which
You're
was
right.
done, I guess, manually originally. Now just more automated. And
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, I don't think that's an elegant solution. I don't have a better idea yet, but we will, right? I think that's a crude solution. But I think this was definitely true in aortic stenosis. Aortic stenosis, if you talk to the cardiothoracic surgeon, they say, we treat all the patients, we have perfect outcomes. We've refined this over 30 years. And I've seen, I couldn't count how many open heart surgeries. I got to start with, these patients are 70, 80 years old and you're doing open heart surgery. That's not good.
Yes.
Let's just start there.
Right.
Okay? Seems like we ought to have some alternative.
Yeah.
2, I told you I was exposed to the early days of balloon valvuloplasty. People were very excited about balloon valvuloplasty.
Yeah.
It gave an opportunity for high-risk patients to have a therapy for aortic stenosis. The problem is it wasn't durable, so it didn't work out. But there was a lot of enthusiasm, and when I talked to physicians who did it, they said patients came out of the woodwork. So I thought, there's something there.
There's more market than you.
Yeah.
People think of the market in a limited way.
So then, when I started really thinking about it, I said, there's an awful lot of patients out there, Scott, who are they're voting with their feet.
Right.
Saying, I'm 80 years old, you're not going to crack my chest open.
Right. Sure. Yeah, they never go from their cardiologist to the surgeon.
Plus, so why is it the surgeon said there's no such thing as a non-surgical patient? Well, one, because they'll do surgery on just about anybody, referred to them. And, their case histories of 90, nanogenarians and patients in their hundreds getting treatment for aortic stenosis through surgery successfully. But how many of them are going back to their home zip code?
Right. Yes.
How many of them have complications?
Yes.
That's minimized. right?
Yeah.
And recovery time at that age is very, very difficult. So, you know, I just thought there's got to be something better than that. And so nobody had quantified it. That's the challenge, of course. Nobody, there was no identified market for this. And if you listen to the experts, they would say, no need for this at all. Now, part of that's protectionism, but earnestly, a lot of that is their experience, right? We do treat all the patients.
Yeah.
So if there's a big need, why are they treating, why do they say that?
Yeah.
Because I always say no one asks the stupid question,
Right.
right? The stupid question was, why would I refer a non-surgical patient to a surgeon,
Exactly.
right?
All these people that are not identified as the market, which may be 5 times bigger than the market that they see.
That's exactly right. So the cardiologist or these internists are sitting all these patients who refuse surgery or are considered non-surgical patients, and they're never referred to the surgeon.
So I know you referenced in an earlier talk that these experts really caused challenges with getting investment, with getting regulatory, probably with getting some clinical adoption. So I'm curious from a couple of standpoints, because you had to overcome those objections. You had to tell the stories to somebody successfully. That how did you sort of think about addressing that expert problem?
Well, let me start with, I mean, I'd been a very successful vice president at Johnson & Johnson, so as an entrepreneur, I could get in to see the top venture capitalists. So I remember going up and down Sand Hill Road, pitching PVT. And of course, the venture capitalists can't be experts in all the stuff they look at, right? So they would listen, they would go, well, that's interesting. I haven't heard that before. You're going to create the first percutaneous treatment for aortic stenosis. We'll look into it. And we'll look into it means, yeah, I don't know enough about this to really render a decision, so we'll reach out to the experts. And who are the experts?
Right.
The experts are the cardiothoracic surgeons, and they say, that's the stupidest idea I ever heard, right? You can't open up aortic stenosis with a stent.
Right.
If you try to do that, the disease will fragment and every patient will have a stroke, right? You can't make something like that durable. You can't make it of the right size. Even if you tried to make it, it would be inferior in terms of performance. They had all kinds of objections to this. And I'll start by saying, I don't think largely they were disingenuous. They were certainly scared of the idea of a percutaneous therapy because stenting had had a negative effect on their open heart surgery business. So they didn't like this idea, you know, competitively. But if you look at the surgeon's experience in surgery, it also kind of flies in the face of that, right? I have to cut out the diseased valve. We're going to do what? We're going to leave this valve in and stent it out of the way? Impossible. We use 30 sutures to hold a surgical valve in place. You're going to use how many? 0? This is never going to be stable. It'll embolize, right? So it did just fly in the face of their experience. So when I think about those objections, I think I have to have a rational answer to all those. My job is to be able to address each one of those. They're not illegitimate, other than kind of the objection that cardiologists don't know anything about this business and ought to stay out of it. That's protectionism. I can't solve that problem. But the others, right? Can I hold it in place? Does it fragment? Does it cause stroke? Can I make it durable? Can I make the flow performance competitive? Those are actually legitimate questions, right? Now, They didn't frame them as legitimate questions. They framed them as, well, this is idiocy.
Right.
You ought to go get a real job.
Right. Yes.
Okay. So, but those objections are things we had to have answers for over time, right? But you're right. You have to have, when you face that kind of withering criticism, you just have to have a belief that, one, there's a big need for this, and two, there's some reasonable chance I can make this work.
Sure.
Right?
And so how did you get that first round of funding when you didn't have that chance covered off yet?
I kissed a lot of frogs. So I went to a lot of venture capital companies, talked to them, and finally found a couple that got behind it, Oxford Bioscience Partners in Boston, and a group out of Israel called Medtech Venture Partners, which was Yuval Benur. And those guys got behind us, and I put together a very talented team of folks with Stan Rubinovich, the two of us working together. We put together an agreement with a group in Israel to do that early development, and the team there, led by Asaf Bosch, was just remarkable. Those guys were willing to take on the unknown. Right.
Were they employees, or was that outsourced?
Well, we started as a contract manufacturing, Scott, which was really interesting. But you can imagine how much fun. I don't know if you've ever negotiated with the Israelis, but it's not a fun experience.
Yeah, that's right.
You have to be up for it. So I negotiated with this guy, and I said, I just really don't like contract engineering. Yeah. Contract engineering, you're incentivized to take longer. Yeah. I'm going to train your engineers, and then I'm going to lose them. Right. You don't really work for outcomes. And so I came back and proposed to him, so listen, what I want to be able to do is, I'm happy to get behind this, but you don't actually have a stake in the game. Right. So I'll pay you to break even, and any upside you get, I'll give you in warrants. That way you have a stake in the outcome. Sure. Two, I'm going to train your engineers. I want to call on them. Right. I want to be able to hire them at the end of this contract if they're good. Right. Three, I'm going to pay you to milestones, right, so that you're incentivized to actually get stuff done. Sure. And we actually came to an agreement, and at the end of that, I hired all of the engineers. Right. And it was a good deal for them too, because when I actually sold the company to Edwards, it doubled the value. This was a 14-month contract. It doubled the value of the whole company. Right.
There you go.
So
that's
it was
very
a win-win.
Innovative. I shouldn't be praising you for this terrible thing you did to the development company, but very clever.
Yeah, it was really a win-win, and it also made me appreciate kind of the style of the Israeli entrepreneurs, right? That you had to sit down and argue through every aspect of what you're doing. And everybody got their say. Yeah. And once you did that, you locked down what your approach was going to be, and everybody would get on board. And I think that was a very healthy way to develop, and I've tried to emulate that.
Yeah, it's like a cultural value in Israeli society that's maybe hard to transplant to other places.
Yeah. Well, I think it is transplantable. I think you can, and you just have to make people comfortable that bringing out the argument and arguing every aspect is healthy, right? Yes. Makes you look at every aspect of what you're doing. Right. So I have huge respect for those guys, and they made huge contributions to design, and they were good clinical engineers. We spent a lot of time in animal labs failing. Yeah. We made a lot of really bad valves. We used the wrong materials. We used the wrong attachment methods. We failed hundreds of times, but we learned. And over time, we made more and more progress towards something that actually behaved like a valve.
And so how did you overcome, like, to get money, you normally have to give some sort of a promise or indication of a milestone, and then how many cycles it's going to take to get there is a bit of a mug's game. So how did you balance that trade-off of certainty?
Well, I mean, we had funding for, well, we ended up having enough funding to do first in human, but of course that was a little unexpected. But we made I mean, even though we had lots of iterations, we had a really good system for fail fast.
Yes.
Right? And that enabled us to go through a lot of iterations and a lot of learning very quickly. And of course, we talked to a lot of valve experts along the way who told us, again, we were wasting our time.
Sure.
But we learned stuff from them. I slowed down the group I wanted to do polymeric valves first, because I was very scared of the fact that we wouldn't be able to make a percutaneous product with tissue. But we actually were able to find a tissue that we could use that was barely percutaneous. It was tough. It was
in terms of the diameter.
It was it was pretty large.
Crossing profile, I guess.
Yeah, because that was always key, right? I mean, I could make a percutaneous valve, but if it was, you know, Henning Anderson was one of the first inventors of percutaneous valves, actually before Cribier. Cribier really broke the rules by saying we can stent aortic stenosis out of the way, but Henning Anderson described collapsible and expandable valves.
Right. I understand you licensed his technology and as part of your startup as well.
I did. I licensed that very early on before we had anything that worked. I actually outbid Edwards.
Outbid Edwards?
To do that
That's
license,
interesting that they would have walked away from that.
You had to
presumably they had the opportunity to bid higher.
We believed, maybe more strongly than they did.
Yes.
But I did license that technology, but you know, Henning had this idea of collapsible and expandable valves, but his valve was 40 French, never going in a femoral artery, right?
Which is around 13 millimeters or so.
Yeah, and I give him huge credit for his early work. I mean, he had no biomedical engineering support, did amazing work. And of course, Cribier didn't know anything about Anderson. So he was independently coming up with these ideas. And he was an amazing collaborator. He and Helen Elchaninov drove into Paris so many times for us to do animal experiments. And we failed so many times. When you put this valve into a young, healthy animal, it embolizes. So we're trying to do this development. We're still hoping it's going to stay and we could understand hemodynamics and all that. But no, we use the disease to hold it in place.
Right. So it
without the disease,
it
was going to embolize. And of course, we couldn't know that until we did it.
Yeah, sure.
But we had
did you realize at the time that it was an imperfect test for that reason, or was it just a failure?
No, we didn't. We didn't. I mean, we hypothesized that could be contributing, but we thought we could make it stay. We couldn't. And it wasn't until we went into Rowe Vermonti's lab, and we started putting these in patients with who had died of aortic stenosis. We put it in cadaveric hearts. I could realize, oh my God, it takes a pair of pliers to pull these things out of aortic stenosis.
Right. Just so much. So rugosity, there's so many little things for it to hook
onto.
Well,
it's like putting it in a concrete block.
Yeah.
Scott, it's calcium and fibrosis, and it's narrowed, you know, this valve area from 3 square centimeters down to 0.6, right? It's a lot of stenosis. So when you put it in there, it just locks into place. You couldn't, you know, we did retention tests. The sutures would break before we could mobilize the valve. Right. Yeah. And so Rowe Vermonti, who thought this was never going to work also, she became a believer that day when she saw it. Yeah. And it wasn't soon after that that Cribier called me up and he said, Stan, I need the valve. I said, well, what do you mean, Alain? So, you know, we're probably 4 or 6 months away from doing our first in human. He said, no, he said, I need the valve. I have a guy who came in who's in cardiogenic shock, and if we don't treat him, he's going to die. I said, okay, well, tell me about it. So this guy's 56 years old. he's probably got a bicuspid valve at that age. Had been a coal miner. So he had bad lungs, which is a big contraindication to surgery. Been turned down by 3 surgical teams. Shows up in Rowe in cardiogenic shock. Crevier does balloon valvuloplasty on him. Not really working.
Yeah.
He has a failed aortobifemoral graft.
Yeah.
An ejection fraction of 8–10%. He's ashen gray and dying.
Right.
How's that for your first in human,
Perfect.
Scott?
You can't go in through your normal ways.
Right.
That's
It's a train wreck.
sounds like an invitation to have a big high-profile failure right out of the gate.
So it's one of those things you look at it, you go, okay, here's Crevier. He wants to save this guy's life. Of course he does. He's a caring, talented physician, and he knows we've got this device we've been working on that could work. So I talked to Marty Leon. Marty says, go ahead and try it. And I'm thinking, this is a really stupid idea, right? We're going to try to save this guy's life under compassionate use. He's going to die, and then the French regulatory authorities are going to come and say, we killed him.
Right.
If you just let him die, they don't care.
Right.
But if we try to save his life and he dies, we killed him.
Right. Yes.
And he's a train wreck.
Yeah.
But then you go back and look at those pictures on the wall.
Right. Wonderful. Sort of an ethical sort of centering. What's this all about?
That's why we did it.
Yeah.
We did it to save a life, and this was our first opportunity. Really? You're going to stand in the way of that?
Right.
You're going to let this guy die without trying?
Yeah.
So I tell people I made a horrible business decision that day.
Right.
But it wasn't a business decision. At that point, it was an ethical decision.
Right.
Do we try to save his life or not? Because I figure whatever happens, we'll deal with the consequence.
Right. Amazing. That's that entrepreneurial spirit again.
I don't know. It's probably just stupidity, but
Oh well.
but
Another word for it.
I sent the team up from Israel, and they showed up in the lab, and Crevier with Helen Elchaninov did this case, and it was, you know, it was the first time anybody had ever done an aortic valve replacement without open heart surgery. And like you mentioned, we couldn't do it the standard way. We couldn't come up through the femoral artery. So we had to do it like a mitral valvuloplasty, which Crevier was skilled in, thank goodness, right? Yeah. So had to make a hole in the atrial septum. So come up the femoral vein, make a hole, take a wire down, take that wire into the left ventricle, push it through the aortic valve antegrade.
Yes.
Okay, and then snare that wire and take it out the contralateral. You could get a small enough catheter in through the contralateral leg to bring out the guide wire. Yeah. So you had a guide wire going all the way through his heart and back out the other leg.
Yeah.
Crazy. And then you take the percutaneous valve through that.
Yes. And
of course, we got it across the atrial septum because he balloon dilated the atrial septum. Then you have to so you come up, you make a 90-degree turn to the atrial septum, then you make another 90-degree turn into the left ventricle, and a 270-degree turn to get to the aortic valve. Wow. So guess what? You prop open the mitral valve in the process, and this guy who has a 10% ejection fraction goes into asystole.
Right. His heart's not beating.
Right. So they actually deploy this valve under chest compressions.
Fully expecting he's not coming back around.
Well, Crevier deployed it under chest compression, so he's hopeful he will.
Right.
Otherwise he wouldn't do it, right?
Right, yeah.
And a few very, very, very long seconds after deploying the valve, he goes back into normal sinus rhythm. And over the next few hours, he turns from ashen and gray to pink, and
Amazing.
he sits up in bed that night. Now think about it, if he had had open heart surgery, he'd be in an ICU, CCU, he'd have tubes coming out. He sits up in bed and drinks a glass of champagne with Cribier.
Never happened before in heart surgery of that magnitude. That's amazing.
So it was quite a dramatic recovery from somebody who was dying. And so we end up getting referrals into Rouen of these people who are dying, right, of aortic stenosis, which is, again, not a good group to prove your efficacy and safety. The procedures went pretty well. Some of the patients died of their comorbidities. And it was a tough place to start, but over time we were able to prove that, this technology was working. And it got Edwards interested, to show that first case and the angiograms of that first case really changed the paradigm.
Sure.
People were pretty shocked, and that was published in, I think Jack published that first case.
That must have got a lot of attention.
I think it did. Certainly in the world of treatment of aortic stenosis, it did, and certainly the cardiothoracic surgeons sat up and paid attention that this was possible, right? They still had all the same objections, but doing that first case was a paradigm shift.
Now you had to raise capital for your next round about that time.
That's right.
And so I'm sure that was helpful in terms of being able to have positive meetings. Maybe circle back to some of those Sandhill guys, or maybe a couple of strategic companies.
Yeah, so I actually went to strategics, and I got Boston Scientific and Medtronic to co-invest, which they'd never done before.
Right.
And I had two very talented people they put on the board. They put Paul LaViolette, who was the COO of Boston Scientific,
Wow, that's impressive.
on the board.
Yeah.
Steve Osterly, who was the chief scientific officer at Medtronic, joined our board. Two great, great people, and loved working with those guys.
And did you have to give away some sort of strategic rights?
I think we gave away European distribution rights, but only after approval or something, so it was
somewhat minimal. It wasn't
not significant.
Right of first refusal to buy the company or anything like that?
No, nothing like that.
Yeah.
So, those guys were great partners, and it's like 9 months later that I had my first conversation with Mike Masalem about PVT, and of course I said, Mike, PVT should be an Edwards company.
Yes.
And Mike said, well, why is that? I said, well, because we offer the biggest risk and the biggest opportunity to Edwards. You're the world's leading heart valve company.
Yeah.
So, we changed the paradigm. You could lose out, or you could help drive it.
It's so interesting because you've got their arch competitors or board members. That's a delicate dance that you're doing there.
It was a delicate dance. He came back and said he was interested, and I said, well, look, if you give me a term sheet, I have to take it to Boston and Medtronic, and that was the one thing he was really concerned about. They didn't have a lot of money in the bank at Edwards at the time, and they didn't want to get into a bidding war with Boston and Medtronic. So, there was a little bit of strategy involved in that. And I put together a subcommittee of the board of directors to evaluate any external bids on the company, evaluate them, and make a recommendation to the board. And I excluded Boston and Medtronic because they would be conflicted.
Yeah, sure.
It took a while, but I got them to agree to that. And so when when we did enter into discussions with Edwards, it could be that group that interfaced with them. But if they sent me a term sheet, I'd have to present it, right?
Absolutely.
So we didn't have a term sheet.
Right.
We did the entire deal, and then I presented it to the board with 72 hours to approve it, or it goes away.
So this is really interesting. So you're working to sort of create some sort of a level playing field, or some maybe even slightly favorable towards Edwards. Meanwhile, you have Boston and Medtronic on your board, and so I'm curious how you think about that. Why did you think Edwards would make a better partner?
Well, you know, again, we talked earlier about it's not always about the money, right? I looked at Edwards and said, you know, these guys have huge technology capability in valves.
Right.
And they could contribute so much to what we're doing. We're kind of amateurs in valves. We've been able to pull this off so far.
Yeah.
But they're experts in durability, and they have material science and all this capability that they could contribute to this to help make it a success long term.
Right. That's the Paramount? Is that their surgical valve?
Yes, yeah, that was their Paramount, their tissue valve. And so clearly that was, you know, a huge opportunity for us to advance this technology, is to integrate Edwards' capabilities.
Right.
Medtronic had a heart valve division, but you know, their construction wasn't the same. It was a tissue, it was more of a porcine valve approach, right? And Boston didn't have any. They had a lot of delivery system capability, but no heart valve group. So that, and the fact that they were the leading company worldwide in heart valves, said I'd be crazy to ignore them.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And you would probably do a deal with some sort of a tail, and that maybe give you the best opportunity to get the win.
Well, but they couldn't afford to do that because Medtronic and Boston, you know, Boston was famous for putting big tails behind early acquisitions. So they had to put a lot of the money up front to do this deal. But yeah, well, I think you know, it was a good investment for Medtronic and Boston, and they made good money on their investment. They were good partners throughout that process. I think Steve Osterly tried to get Medtronic to make a bid. Their heart valve group, again, thought that this was a dumb idea.
Right.
And so they couldn't convince the CEO to put it in.
They're heavily invested in the surgical approach, basically, which is the same resistance you'd seen all over the place. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And so that kind of undermined his capability. Boston, they said, we could probably come up with a bigger number, but it'd have more back end. So, you know, this is a good deal for you. You want to take it?
Fascinating.
So we were able to do this deal with Edwards, and I give, again, Mike Masalem especially huge credit. Their scientific advisory board was all surgeons. And guess what they thought about this idea, right? They told Mike it was a dumb idea and he shouldn't do it, and he still did it. So there's your contrarian. And he had to borrow money to buy the company.
That's also interesting.
You got to give him huge credit to take that on.
It's a big risk personally to his career, and fascinating. There's two other things that I'd be interested in, sort of along these themes. One is the regulatory side, and one is sort of the politics of the clinical environment. So maybe we start with the regulatory. So, like, this is in Europe, starting to get some momentum. But you know, the FDA is a whole other animal. Can you talk a little bit about your regulatory journey on this product?
I wish I could say it was simpler, but it wasn't. In their infinite wisdom, FDA decided that the group that should evaluate transcatheter heart valves was the surgical heart valve group. Right? That's like, you know, we're going to have the wolves, you know, look after the chickens. Right?
That's right. Yeah. They promised not to eat them.
Well, they made no such promise, and boy, they were problematic from day one. And it was such an embarrassment ultimately to FDA that so We got an approval 5 years earlier in Europe.
Right.
This is a life-saving technology.
Right.
So FDA is in charge of protecting the US public, right?
Yes.
But it's also there to approve products that improve and save the lives of Americans,
Yes.
right? It took them 5 years longer to approve this. We got an approval in the United States. We were the 42nd country
Yes.
to get approval, right after Tunisia. So I think it was such an embarrassment to FDA that they, I think the EFS was part of the answer.
Right.
This early feasibility study to try to promote early access and collaboration with the FDA in a more congenial environment. But those specialty interests were preserved in those early days, and they made it very, very difficult for us.
I recall that the early clearance was really very narrow. It was only inoperable patients and so on, right?
Well, I mean, that to me was kind of understandable that we were going to go into high risk and non-surgical patients first. And, you know, we did the partner trial, but, you know, a lot of the stuff with FDA was around testing and durability and all that, and they made all that very, very difficult for us. And just approving the trial took forever, right? And yeah, it was very difficult working with them. And the CE mark really served Europeans better,
right,
in that respect. So that was difficult. And I think the clinical environment was interesting. You know, we didn't want to leave the surgeons, the experts, out of that. And so, and this was Larry Wood's, I think, genius, was the idea of the partner trial said we were going to have surgeons and cardiologists who were co-investigators at every single site.
right,
And with the definition, they had to work together
yes,
in patient selection and collaboration. And that was almost the foundation of what is now done at almost every hospital, where they have this group of people who look over a lot of the patients who come in with aortic stenosis or mitral regurgitation. This valve group in hospitals that are collaboration between surgeons, cardiologists, nursing, echo. They all come together for these reviews of patients, and I think it provides better outcomes. But I think part of it was this trial that instigated that collaboration.
So this is so interesting. The sort of, again, that sort of prioritizing the structure of the trial. It's kind of leading towards your facilitating of some sort of market entry. So thinking very holistically, again, beyond the technical and the regulatory and so on. So
yeah, I think even though the surgeons were very reticent to accept this technology, I think their exposure and their experience at the hospital level as co-investigators brought them much closer to accepting this over time. And so, yes, I think, I mean, you can call that marketing. I just call that good common sense. But I think that, you know, I think that led to acceptance from that community over time. And even though it impacted their business, obviously.
yeah, well, they go from being the most important doctor in the hospital, arguably, as the cardiothoracic surgeon. Now this is reducing their power, their political power in some way.
Well, I think, you know, especially the first indication, high risk and non-surgical, are no fun for the surgeon, right?
Right, sure.
These are the ones where they have the most complications.
Yeah.
The patients spend the most time in the hospital.
Yeah.
You know, it's not necessarily the patients they love to treat.
Fascinating. It's a little bit echoes the Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, that you take away business they don't really like. That's kind
Right,
of, that's
right,
and then
right.
gradually maybe you start edging into business they do like. But
That's right, that's right. And which is exactly what happened over time, right, with the
yeah.
next partner trials.
Yes. Fascinating. So roll the clock forward a little bit. So you start to have some early clinical results with very difficult patients in Europe. You get European clearance. It starts to grow as a market. And now it's in the 10 billion range. Or how big is the?
Yeah, I think it is around $10 billion.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a gigantic, very successful industry now.
Yeah.
And that's the most remarkable thing. So how did you sort of hinted at the setting up Edwards as the acquirer, and so that obviously happened. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Well, one of the things I give Edwards huge credit for was the integration of our small company. I think we only had 20 people or so in the company, but
20 people did all that. That's very impressive.
They wanted everybody to stay on board, and I think all but one person did. Mm-hmm. And that was more her personal circumstance. Right. But everybody else stayed on and stayed on for years. Right. And so, personally, I thought, I'll be here a year or two. Mm-hmm. Right. But, I moved out here to California for Edwards, joined their executive leadership team, and ended up staying for 15 years and becoming their chief scientist and working across a broad spectrum of structural heart disease development. Sure. And, that's been a great privilege to do that. So I think it worked out for Edwards. Mm-hmm. It was probably, it's the thing that drove the most value for them. Yeah. It was not always straightforward. We had lots of issues, obviously, in the clinical trials. Some of our early cases were difficult. But there was a lot of iteration that went on, a lot of improvement, a lot of focus, and Edwards never gave up, never slowed down on developing this technology, and it's obviously been hugely impactful to the company. And I'm sure the great majority of their earnings come from transcatheter valve division. Right.
Mm-hmm. Remarkable. So, what a wonderful story. Maybe I would wish I could talk to you for 2 more hours about all the intricacies of that. As an engineering physicist myself, I'm kind of attracted to the technical things, but maybe we'll, I know you've been involved subsequently in an incubator called NXT, which maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that is and the impacts and so on.
Well, NXT was kind of my garage shop, right? What do I do afterwards? I want to keep my brain busy, and still, I consider what we do for a living a privilege. Yes. And we're serving patients, and it's remarkable to be able to help patients with new technologies, and wanted to be able to still do that in my bad idea for retirement. And so I got some funding from Deerfield Capital and J&J and Edwards, and we funded it for 5 years. We're actually kind of shutting down NXT, and our new, kind of the next iteration of that is called Nidus Biomedical. Oh, okay. And we got several really important projects going on. We're kind of self-funded at this point. Yeah. And it's really exciting to still be able to do early development. I think I just filed a patent 2 weeks ago. Okay. On a new technology, and so I still trying to keep the neurons focused on things that might help patients in the future, and I love doing this work. Mm-hmm. I still want to be able to travel with my wife, who's got wanderlust and wants to see every country in the world.
Well, bring her up to Victoria.
Yeah. So we travel around the world and want to have some of that flexibility. Sure. But I still want to do this development work, and I've got a very talented team, many of whom came from Edwards, that work with me, and they meet that criteria. They're a lot smarter than I am, but I respect what they're doing, and they're amazing innovators, and we're developing several really important technologies there, and I'm having fun doing that.
And it's your company now.
Yeah.
You no longer have the partners and investors.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. I'm not, I'd say it's our company, right? We've divided it among all of the...
Oh, it's like an employee-owned company.
Yeah, exactly. It's an employee-owned company, which is, I think, the best kind.
That's remarkable.
And yeah, we're all having a lot of fun doing that early development. And of course, fundraising isn't fun for anybody these days.
Yeah, I know that's true.
I get the privilege of an audience,
Yes.
but probably nothing else.
Right.
But we'll get there.
Yeah. Wow, what a wonderful story. So we're just wrapping up here. Is there any sort of high-level thoughts that you want to share with our audience?
You know, I think the privilege of what we do is to serve patients, and if we keep them in the center
Yes.
of our decision making, and we learn, you know, the medicine around them and their plight and their perspective,
Yeah.
and we give them better alternatives
Yeah.
and better therapies, and we learn about innovation in the process, we can be really effective at changing medicine in a positive way.
Sure.
And I think it's really nice to look on your career and say, I did something for patients.
Sure.
The privilege for me is always being able to meet them.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I remember being in Rowe one time. I was meeting with Cribier about some of the studies we were doing, and one of the patients we had treated early on in these very high-risk patients was there for a follow-up. She was there for like her 1-year follow-up.
Yeah.
And she learned that I was in the hospital and tracked me down. And she said, thank you for saving my life.
Yeah.
And she told me about vacationing over the summer with her family in the south of France.
Yeah.
And it's something I'll never, ever forget. And to have that privilege of knowing that you've impacted these lives is, well, it's something we always carry with us.
That's right. It's about stories and people and connections. Fantastic. What a wonderful way to end. Well, Stan Rowe, it's been a total privilege. Speaking of privilege, total privilege to talk to you today.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. I've really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you. Stan Rowe is one of the iconic entrepreneurs in the history of medical technology. Spoke with him at some length. In the first one, he really talks about his early career and how he got started. He learned to balance the technology side and the market needs side and the clinical practice side of not just developing the product, but also developing the whole clinical process and the surgery around it. I'm sure you really enjoyed that.